us this morning to have a look at the most recent EDI results for School District 5 and School District 6 areas in the southeast Kootenay, to think a little bit about the implications of those results and possibly do some planning about how you might be using the results in your community. So as Jennifer said, you can just type in questions as you go along. I am not as familiar with doing webinars as I am as just getting up and talking to people, so I always really appreciate a little bit of interaction, and even if it's in this this kind of form. And then we also will have time for questions at the end. So we'll get going here. So just briefly, this is what we're hoping to cover this morning. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I suspect that most of you are quite familiar with the EDI, but I always want to make sure that people know about the EDI and how it's administered and how it's analyzed. I'm going to touch briefly on the provincial results in BC, and then I'm going to dig in more specifically to the East Kootenay results and looking both at the level of the school district and the level of the neighborhood, what some of the trends over time have been. Spend some time talking about the why, or some of the considerations for what we think are the roots of childhood vulnerability in British Columbia and certainly in your communities as well. Talk a little bit about the local lessons in terms of the kinds of things that people can do to hopefully positively impact on their EDI results, and then finish off with any questions as we go along. So the EDI, just briefly, is a 104 item, more or less, checklist completed by kindergarten teachers on every child in their classroom. It's completed in February. It's really designed to be a reflection of the quality of children's experiences before they get to school. So even though we complete the EDI in the school system, it really isn't about school. We do that because kindergarten is really the first opportunity to capture all children. And so if we're going to have a universal population level measure of children's development at age 5, when the majority of children enter the K-12 system, is our first opportunity to do that. The EDI is based on the teachers' observations between September and when they complete the EDI in February. As you can see there, it's broken down into 5 different domains or scales of development. You can see them there: language and cognitive communications, physical health and well-being, social competence, and emotional maturity. And as we look at the results for your areas, we'll get a little bit more into what each of those scales measures. We really like the EDI because it is a holistic measure of children's development. It just doesn't focus on, sort of the traditional academic competencies, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but really does give us a holistic picture of how children are doing when they enter kindergarten. A couple of important things to remember about the EDI. Although it's filled out on individual children, we never do an analysis of individual results, and I would never talk to you about how Johnny was doing on his EDI or how Mary was doing on her EDI. It's designed to be a population or a large group measure, so we analyze and report on the results at the level of the school district, at the level of the neighborhood. And it really is a way to help us understand trends in the development of kindergarten children. Importantly, it is not, as I've mentioned, an individual child or diagnostic measure, nor is it a way to evaluate teachers or kindergarten. We've been collecting the EDI in BC actually since about 1999, when we did our first pilots in Vancouver and a couple of other school districts, and then provincially we started to collect the data in 2001, 2002. The results that we're going to look at today come from what we call Wave 2, Wave 3, Wave 4, and Wave 5. And as you can see there, that is looking at how kids have been doing between 2004 and the present day. So it really is a look at the trends in children's development over a decade. And in your part of the world, you have always been strong proponents and participants in EDI. So in fact, both of School District 5 and School District 6 have participated in every year of data collection since 2004. So when you see the results, those are rolled up. So for an example, for the Wave 4 results, we take the results from 2009-10 and 2010-11, and we put all of those kids together and roll them up into the result for that wave. Particularly in areas where there are some small communities like yours, this is a really good way to have a large enough population so that the data has more stability and more meaning for us when we have it in large populations. What we normally report on when we report on the EDI is what we call vulnerability. And so if children score below the vulnerability cutoff on any of the 5 EDI scales, they're said to be vulnerable on that scale of development. And then if children are vulnerable on any scale, then they also are part of the overall vulnerability report. So when you see, 32% of children are vulnerable in any one particular neighborhood or province, then you know that they're vulnerable on any scale. We also know that without additional support and care, these children may experience future challenges in school and society. So we determine vulnerability based on children's scores, and as you can see from that little diagram at the bottom there, that little picture, the children who fall below the bottom 10% of all scores in BC are below the vulnerability cutoff. So it's not the bottom 10% of children, but children who score in the bottom 10% of all scores. And we've learned over time that that vulnerability cutoff is really very predictive of how children are going to do later on in their school life. And what you're seeing on the screen now is a little table that links EDI vulnerabilities to later outcomes specific to the standardized tests that are done in grade 4 throughout the school system. So on the left-hand side of that table, you see the number of vulnerabilities that children have, and you can see they can come into kindergarten with no vulnerabilities and up to 4 or 5 vulnerabilities, which would mean that they were vulnerable on all 5 of those scales that I showed you earlier. And as you can see, the relationship between the number of vulnerabilities and how children are doing goes up directly with the number of vulnerabilities. So if kids are coming into school with no vulnerabilities, then 12.3% of those kids are not meeting expectations or passing the grade 4 standardized assessment tests in numeracy, and 17.8% of them are not passing in reading. If they have 1 vulnerability, you can see that that goes up to 22.2 kids who aren't meeting expectations in numeracy, and 33.9 that aren't meeting expectations on the reading assessment. You can see that goes up again if kids are coming in with 2 or 3 vulnerabilities. And then you can see for those kids who are coming into kindergarten with 4 or 5 vulnerabilities, 55.6% of them are not meeting expectations on the numeracy standardized assessment, and 68.3, or nearly 70% of those kids, are not meeting expectations on the reading assessment. So, I mean, this graph tells us a couple of things. It tells us, of course, that early vulnerability is depressingly predictive of how kids are going to do as they proceed through the system. It also tells us that the way that we're measuring vulnerability using the EDI is capturing those kids accurately. So it actually provides a measure of predictive validity for the EDI. So before I go on to talk a little bit about provincial results, just wanted to check in if people had specific questions about the EDI, how it was administered, analyzed, those kinds of things. So I'll just take a breath for a moment, and if you have questions about any aspect of the EDI implementation and analysis, then this is the time to ask them. I'll take a breath and a sip of coffee. Okay, doesn't seem like there's any questions unless you guys are super slow typers, so I'll just carry on, and feel free to type as we go along. So many of you will have seen the provincial EDI results. So using that measure of whether or not children are vulnerable on any of the scales, in 2007, which was the end of Wave 2, 29% of all kids across BC were vulnerable on at least one scale of their development, and so close to 30% at that time. And then what's happened over time is in 2013, so at the end of Wave 5, that number had risen to 33% of all kids in BC vulnerable in some aspect of their development. And as you will know, and as we'll see, even when we look at the East Kootenay results, there's quite a lot of variation in terms of vulnerability around the province. So we have some school districts that are as low as 11 or 12% of kids vulnerable, up to about 55% of kids vulnerable, and everything in between. When you go to the neighborhood level, the variation is even bigger. So we have neighborhoods in BC that are as low as 5 or 6% of kids vulnerable, and as high as 60% or more of kids vulnerable. So the 33% number, or the 1/3 of BC kids, is when you take the whole provincial population. But we know when we dig into the story, there are a lot of different stories around the province in terms of how kids are doing. But I haven't put any slides into this presentation about the importance of early child development, because I know I would be preaching to the very much converted on that front. But I don't think we can ever forget to remind ourselves that when 33% of our kids, or 1/3 of our kids, are going into kindergarten behind where we would want them to be, knowing how early vulnerability tracks into later lifelong happiness, well-being, health, that we can not think of this as really an acute crisis for our society in terms of having that large of a percentage of kids vulnerable at that entry into school. So I hope that it serves for all of us as a rallying cry that it isn't a number that we can accept is going to continue to creep up over time, because it will mean really a lot of challenges for our future society, and obviously a lot of challenges for these children who are starting out their educational journey with those kinds of challenges ahead. I'm going to talk a little bit more towards the end of the webinar about the why of that, but we'll leave that for now and start to look a little bit at the East Kootenay results. So there you are. I don't know why I put that map up, but I did, and shows you as that part of the province. I don't think there's anybody on the webinar today from Golden, if I'm correct. I mean, Golden is a part of School District 6, but I think that it's part of a different early child development realm. So if you are from Golden, then make sure you say so. Otherwise, I'm not going to speak very much about the Golden results, but I'll speak about all of the other areas in the Southeast Kootenay. So School District 5, and what you're looking at here are the overall results from Wave 5, and I'm going to show you some trends over time in a minute, but this is really as much as anything to get ourselves oriented to the neighborhoods in this part of the world. So as you can see, Fernie and Sparwood Elkford are two areas that are analyzed together. Then we have a big area that is called Cranbrook Rural, so it's all of that land that is surrounding downtown Cranbrook, but not as far out as Fernie and the Elkford Valley, obviously. And within Cranbrook itself, we have three neighborhoods named North, East, and South. So you can see the range from the last Wave 5 results, a low of 20% of kids vulnerable in that Cranbrook rural area, up to a high of 30% in Cranbrook North. And one of the things to note about those results is that there actually is not a huge variation. In many school districts around the province, as I said, you'll see differences in neighborhoods that are quite large, from 10% in some neighborhoods up to 50+%, whereas here you're seeing all of the neighborhoods just within that 10% range, from 20 up to 30%. When we look at School District 6, you can see there's the three neighborhoods, Golden, Windermere, and Kimberley, and I'm just going to talk about Windermere and Kimberley today. You can see that 23% of kids were vulnerable in Windermere, and 32%, or about a third, or the same as the provincial number, in Kimberley. And I'm going to come back to these neighborhood results in a little bit. Just to comment, though, on the creation of neighborhoods, those of you who have been around for a while will know that we changed our EDI neighborhoods before we reported on Wave 5 and made them larger. We wanted to do that because, as I said earlier, it gives a bit more stability in the data, particularly in those smaller areas where you may only have 15 or 20 kindergarten kids each year. We know with that we've lost a little bit of the local specificity in terms of the results, but it's important to know that the school districts also receive school level reports, and if you're really keen to find out how kids are doing, you know, in any particular part of, say, that large Windermere area, then it is, I really do suggest that you get in touch with your school district and sit with them and look at the school level results over time to see how you can understand those trends as well. So I'm going to go now and look at the School District 5 trends over time, and I apologize for this slide. I never seem to be able to get these to be saved into an image that's sharp and crisp. But anyways, we can still see them. So what you're seeing here is the School District 5 trends over time. So this is for the entire school district. And you can see that the trend has actually been to the good, which is different than what we have seen in most places in the province. So at the end of wave 2, the overall vulnerability was about 32% of kids vulnerable. That dropped a little bit in wave 3 to about 28%, stayed there in wave 4, and then dropped again, this time fairly dramatically to about 23%. So that's really a good news story over time, and would be School District 5 be one of the lower vulnerability places in the province. And I'm going to show you some comparisons to other places in the province in a minute or two. And then what you're seeing below that with the different colored lines is the contribution of the different kinds of vulnerability. And so you see at the very bottom of those lines a pink line and an orange line. The pink line represents the language and cognitive development scale, and the orange line represents the communication skills scale. And you can see that those two scales, the contribution to vulnerability has been relatively flat over time, so you don't see a particular gradient one way or the other, and they have been the lowest contributors to vulnerability overall. So the fewest amount of children are vulnerable on those two scales, language and cognitive, and communications over time. That's fairly consistent with what we see around the province. Not the flatness of the contribution, but the least amount. So when we look provincially, it's most common for there to be good news stories about how kids are doing on their language and cognitive development. And then the other three, the green one is the physical health and well-being, the blue one is the social competence, and the purple is the emotional maturity. And you can see that the emotional maturity has dropped quite a bit over time. It started out to be the highest contributor, and now it's about the same as the social competence. And the physical health and well-being has bounced around a little bit more. When we look at the trends over time in School District 6, you can see that it's more of a common trend that we're seeing in other places in the province, and that is to increasing vulnerability. So whereas in Wave 2 we were about 22% overall vulnerability, at the end of Wave 5 it was up to about 30% of kids vulnerable across the entire school district. So that's including Golden, Windermere, and Kimberley areas all rolled up together. You can see that the pattern of the contribution is relatively the same. So again, the language and the communication skills are the lowest contributors, whereas the physical, social, and emotional scales are the higher contributors. You can see that there's been a bit more of a dramatic increase over time on the physical health and well-being scale, that's the green one, and sort of a gradual upward in terms of the social and emotional scales. And when I think about, what the so what of EDI results, and we can talk a little bit more about this later as well, it really is, acknowledging that we have made some good gains in respect to children's language and cognitive skills, but the area where there are more challenges for children and their parents and communities is how we collectively support more effectively children's social and emotional development. And we know from all of the stats these days that later concerns with children's mental health, anxiety, worries, depression, etc., those kinds of things are really increasing. And we know that those kinds of later mental health challenges are really rooted in children's early social and emotional development. So I think collectively this is an area that we have to really take on and determine how we can better impact on those kinds of outcomes. Show you a couple more provincial results, and then I'll take or district results, and I'll take a bit of a breath. So what you're seeing here is the relationship between the results in School District 5. So again, these are district wide results and how they relate to the rest of the province. So hopefully you can see that little black line in each of these graphs, and that just shows you where in the distribution of all of the school district results in the province. So there's 59 school districts, so there's actually 59 lines in each of those little graphs, where School District 5 lines up. And you can see that in each of those graphs that the School District 5 is towards the left-hand side or the lower end of the distribution. So if you were to look at all of the school districts provincially, School District 5 would certainly be in the group that we would consider to be lower vulnerability provincially. That being said, still 24% of kids at the end of Wave 5 were vulnerable in some aspect of their development. Higher contributors, the 12% in both the social and emotional. So still lots of challenges within that school district. We certainly wouldn't want to say that 25% of kids, just because it happens to be in the lower range in BC, is something that is acceptable. When you look at the same graph for School District 6, you can see that it's a little bit more in the middle of the distribution when you're talking about 30% of kids vulnerable. Actually quite on the high end of the social competence, so you can see that 18% in that blue graph, that is towards the right hand of the distribution. So if you looked around the province, School District 6 would be among the higher vulnerability group in both the social and the emotional. Although the emotional, you can see that that black line that's showing the 17% is a bit more towards the middle of the distribution. Pretty much smack in the middle of the distribution with the 10% on language and cognitive development. And in the lower half, or the lower vulnerability of the distribution, with that 11% on the orange or communication skills scale. So I'm going to stop for a minute and get any questions or comments about what we've seen so far. So that is 2008, 9, 2009, 10. That's the cohort of kindergarten kids that are being measured by that Week 3 data. You know, have a conversation with people in the community. Was that a particularly strong cohort of kids? We often know that, you know, sometimes you'll just have a year of kids that is particularly challenging or particularly strong in terms of their development. So thinking about that in respect to your community. Cranbrook East, you can see that again, it's actually over time gone from 42% down to about 23%. So although it's bounced around over time, you really would say that Cranbrook East at the end of Wave 2 compared to the end of Wave 5 is a significantly different place in terms of childhood vulnerability. And I would be, you know, really reflecting again with the community about the kinds of things that have happened in that community between 2007 and 2013. Sparwood, Elkford is a place that over time you basically say there has been no change. You know, very similar numbers, 22, 26, 25, 25. So, you know, steady at around a quarter of the kids in that community vulnerable over time. Similar kind of thing in Cranbrook South. You know, it's inched down a little bit over time, but really only from 29% down to 26% at the end of Wave 5. And Cranbrook North, like Cranbrook Rural and Cranbrook East, really, you know, going from 45 to 30% of kids vulnerable. Again, I would be really confident to say that the state of childhood vulnerability in that neighborhood has changed meaningfully over time, and it would be really worth digging in with the community about the kinds of things that have happened. Has it been changes in development? Has it been changes in the service structure? Has there been new supports for families? Is there a different socio-demographic character of this neighborhood over time? Because that kind of significant one-directional improvement is very rare, frankly, across the province. So it's really worth digging into it and seeing what we might learn from that. What you see in Windermere and Kimberley is also a meaningful change over time in the other direction. So going from 13% up to 23% of kids vulnerable in the Windermere area. So still a fairly low vulnerability area at 23% overall, but definitely a significant increase over time. Kimberley going from 24% at the end of Wave 2 up to 32%. So again, really wanting to dig in that between 2007 and 2013, how have our communities changed? And they may, you know, it's maybe not looking for the big things that have changed. You know, often people will say, oh, well, there was a big new development or a mill closed. I mean, obviously those things are going to have an impact, but sometimes it's looking more for the sort of drip, drip, drip of change over time. Well, how has the character of the community been changing in a way that wouldn't impact most on families with young children? So I'm not going to spend too much time in looking at each of the specific scales, but what I would like to say is that you know, when you look at any of these EDI products, dark is more. So when you see those dark areas on this data table, no matter what the color, you know that those are the more highly vulnerable areas. And I would just look at where you see a consistent pattern over time. So for example, if I was to look at that Cranbrook East neighborhood in respect to its physical health and well-being, you can see that the darkest number there is at 21% at the end of Wave 2, and then there is a trend to the light over time, so that you can
really think about that the impact on physical health and well-being has been positive. And just as I go through these and give an example from each of the scales, we'll just talk for a minute about what the scales measure. So physical health and well-being has two kind of parts to it. One really looks at children's fine and gross motor development, and the other is about how children are physically prepared for the day. So do they come to school hungry? Are they late? Are they properly dressed? How many days of kindergarten do they miss? So those are the kinds of things that you would see in respect to physical health and well-being. Looking at Kimberly on the social competence scale, you can see that the darkest number, the 25%, is in wave 5, so you can see that that's a trend over time, although fairly flat in those first 3 rounds, a big jump in wave 5. So when you look at the big jump in vulnerability in wave 5 in Kimberley specifically, it is being driven considerably by the social competence scale. So in terms of how you might use those results locally, this might be an area where you would want to focus the dialogue with community members. And social competence is really about how children get along in the classroom. Are they able to follow instructions, sit quietly in the circle, those kinds of things. How do they engage in learning? A lot of the stuff on the social competence scale is consistent with what a lot of people are talking about now around children's ability to self-regulate. And so thinking about how to approach this particular area of children's development, it would be really valuable to look at some of the self-regulation literature and strategies in terms of thinking about how you might implement those in programs in the community. If you look at the next one, that is emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is more about children's sort of ability to get along with peers on the playground. So, do they fight? Are they anxious and withdraw? Those kinds of things. And you can see again with the remembering that dark is more, that Cranbrook North neighborhood has gone from a high of about 30% in the wave 2 down to about 9% in wave 5. So in looking at the next one, which is language and cognitive development, so that's really the traditional ABCs of school readiness, early literacy, early numeracy. Interesting place to look at there is actually Windermere, where you see that there's been a very low contribution of language and cognitive development vulnerability over time, that it stayed completely flat at 5% over time. And, there'd be lots to think about there in respect to literacy initiatives in the community, public awareness in terms of, parents of young children knowing about the importance of reading to their kids and all of those sorts of things. Now the communication skills scale, which is cut off my screen for, oops. I'm going to look over here because my screen's cut off for communication skills scale. Yeah, I mean, again, you'll see in that Windermere area that it's been a fairly low contribution over time. The communication skills scale is really about how children communicate in English. And so we would anticipate in areas where English as a second language is not as common, so pretty much areas outside of the Lower Mainland or the Lower Mainland, or Victoria,
you're going to see that that is probably low vulnerability compared to other places in the province. Okay, so I'm going to stop again. Please ask questions about your particular neighborhood, any particular scale that you're interested to make sure that we're highlighting the numbers and results in a way that is helpful to your local context. So I'll ask a question. What in these results surprises you? Oh, we have a question here. Oh, repeat what makes up the physical health and well-being scale. So there are two main areas of the physical health and well-being scale. The first is fine and gross motor development. So, can this child hold a pencil? Can this child do gross motor things like go up the slide in the playground and those kinds of things? And then there are questions about children's physical preparedness for the day. So do they come to school hungry? Are they late? Are they fatigued? Are they well dressed? It factors in how many days children are missing kindergarten. So one of the clearest relationships we see between the EDI and child poverty rates around the province is on the physical health and well-being scale. So because there are a lot of items in there that typically relate to children's or their family's income level, you'll often see a close relationship between child poverty and how kids are doing on the physical health and well-being scale. If you're in a community where you look around and you say, hey, our physical health and well-being vulnerability has really gone up, but there isn't any evidence to say that our child poverty rate has gone up, then I would really start to dig in with the early childhood educators and the kindergarten teachers more around the issues of fine and gross motor development. So that would be what I would say about that.
We have one more question, Joanne.
Okay.
How are the results analyzed when there is a significant drop in the overall numbers of children being surveyed?
So they're analyzed in the same way. Can you just tell me if there's a specific example, because that might help me answer your question in a way that is most relevant. So is there a specific drop in numbers that you're looking at? Oh, can you unmute her?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So, so I'm from the Windermere Valley, and just kind of looking at our statistics here, where I believe it's the where we're hitting the 5% there, and we're static there in the one category.
Oh, in the language and cognitive development, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. So, but when you look at the numbers, where there's 240 compared to 165 being kind of in the last wave there, how is that different? Like, how is that affecting our results?
Well, it shouldn't. I mean, it's not affecting your results too dramatically, because there's still a good population of kids there, even at 165. I mean, if you drop down below 100 kids, then I would be looking at the results a little bit differently. But it's still a solid population, and so you can certainly be confident that those percentages are reflecting a meaningful vulnerability rate. I mean, obviously the absolute number of kids is different. So 5% of 240, obviously is different than 5% of 165. So in terms of the absolute number of kids that you're dealing with, that is different. The other thing is that you would want to look at, and this is where I would really recommend that you go to the critical difference information on the website, and that'll really help you do the specifics of the calculation in terms of looking at your neighborhood at 2 points of time and putting in those numbers, so the 240 and the 165, to help you see where there are meaningful differences over time. But just eyeballing eyeballing your results, I can see that there are meaningful differences over time. So when I look at the overall number of 13 to 23%, because I'm familiar with how the calculations work, I feel really confident to say that, Windermere is a more highly vulnerable area now than it was in 2007, even with that population change. Same thing for physical health and well-being, and for the emotional maturity, which is the 3 to 10%. The other ones I would say have been stable over time, but it really would be worth it, Megan, to go onto the website and do that bit of math for yourself, so that when you're explaining the results to people in your community, that it will make sense to you as well.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, I noticed, like I did do some of the math already, and that's what I was trying to figure out. Like in certain categories, I think, like in the physical health and well-being, like we've increased over 220%.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's.
And does that make sense to you in terms of, what I was saying in respect to child poverty? Like, would you say that in your area there's been an increase in child poverty over that last 6 or 7 years?
I haven't, you can just tell. I would probably say yes. You can just take a look at our just everything from our housing market to the price of, groceries here. It's the cost of living is extremely high and wages are fairly low. So I could see how that makes complete sense. So.
So it certainly would be a place to sort of work with the results in the community, and knowing that the physical and health and well-being is one of those more concrete ones. I mean, sometimes when we start to take on the social and emotional scales, it gets a little more complex in terms of how people can collectively work together to impact that. But the physical health and well-being, particularly because it is some of that basic preparedness for school stuff, is sometimes a place where communities can strategize together quite effectively.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Other questions or surprises for people?
And if anybody would like some help calculating critical difference, you're not sure how to do it, there is some information on our website, but it can get a little complicated. You can let me know, and we can do the calculations for you and email them right back to you. So just send me an email. My name is Jennifer. My last name is Fox. So my email is just jennifer.fox@ubc.ca. And just go on our website and contact anybody in the knowledge translation team, and we can help you out with critical difference.
Thanks, Jennifer. Other questions or surprises in terms of these results? Okay, well let's just carry on then. I've got a few things to say. I have a couple of soapboxes to pull out to talk about the roots of vulnerability, and then some of the things that we have learned over time help to make a difference at the local level in terms of how you're dealing with these results. I am trying to click my slides, believe it or not. Let's try the mouse, see if that works. Nope. There we go. Something very big is happening to family life in British Columbia is actually a quote from Clyde. Not that long before he died, he was being interviewed, and the interviewer was asking him about why vulnerability rates in British Columbia were going in the wrong direction, and that things on average were getting worse around the province. And that is, that's what he said, that something very big is happening to family life in British Columbia. And I think, Megan, you kind of touched on it when you were talking about the experience of families in your part of the world in the Windermere area, that generally it is harder for families with young children now to balance their responsibilities in both earning enough to look after their families and having enough quality time and access to quality services to be able to care for their kids in the way that they want to. We are one of the lowest investors in Canada and certainly in BC as well in terms of early childhood programs. We do the EDI in all of the provinces and territories with the exception of Nunavut across Canada, and we see these trends in terms of children's vulnerability being the same across the country, although in BC they're a little bit worse. And I think that the reason that we would say is that BC, the economic challenges for families, the cost of housing, the debt that people are having to carry, the amount of time that people are having to work, the lack of affordable, accessible childcare and other quality support services is more acute in British Columbia than in anywhere else in the country. So I think there are things that we can do at the local level to really address some of the local specific data, but we also know that one of the things that we all have to do is to advocate for broader public investment in early childhood, again going back to all that we know about the science of early child development and all that we have known for well over 20 years now about why we would invest in young children. We still haven't really done it, and so hopefully for all of us we continue with that advocacy role in terms of if we're going to turn the tide on vulnerability overall, that is how we're going to have to do it.
If anybody's interested, we did host a separate webinar on this topic, investment in early childhood, and we also did some comparisons with Canada and other countries and their family policies and investments. So our senior researcher here at Help, Linnell Anderson, did a webinar about that, and you can view that on our website. Just go under the videos tab, and it will be up there on our website. It's also on our YouTube channel.
Thank you. And a couple of other things, or more than a couple of other things, and these are the things that I often suggest are the topics that for your Friday night glass of wine or your Sunday morning cup of coffee, whenever it is that you get together with your family and friends and neighbors and colleagues, to really start to talk about them. They're the trends in our culture that are impacting on children's development, and many of them we're just allowing to drip, drip, drip away until there has been substantive change without really thinking about how we might manage some of these that are certainly more in the interest of our children. Technology, of course, is something that has really revolutionized and improved in many ways our ability to communicate with one another. But like all things, it's about moderation. The Canadian Pediatric Society just came out along with the American Pediatric Society to say that children under the age of 2 should have no screen time at all, so no TV, no movies, no iPads propped up in cribs before the age of 2, and then after the age of 2, a very moderate, half to 2 hours a week of screen time. So really helping kids, in terms of their self-regulation. If they're receiving continual stimulation, there's lots of evidence to say that that's going to be challenging for them in terms of self-regulation. And then, of course, we also have to think about how technology has impacted on parents' ability and time to interact with their children, because there are a lot of demands on all of us as adults to be responding to more emails and communicating more with the technology that we have available, but often that is at the expense of just being able to sit down and have a conversation with our children. Lack of physical activity, these two things are kind of connected, but overall we know that the obesity rates for kids in Canada are rising, and that kids are overall more sedentary than they have ever been. So what can we do to get our kids out and being more active? Nutrition, again, obesity rates point to that. Really trying to find ways to, given the challenges of time in our society, for people to be relying less on fast foods and things that we know are not tremendously good for our kids. The MDI results, and we haven't talked about MDI today, but I hope that many of you know that that's our middle years development instrument that's administered at grade 4 and grade 7. It asks questions about how often kids are sitting down and having family meals, and also how often they're having breakfast. And that has been the area from the MDI results that the lowest percentage of kids are reporting those kinds of family meal activities or having breakfast. So there's lots for us to think about in that area. Bubble wrap children, so this is the way that we really protect our kids from conflict and disappointment, and really don't allow them to get out in the world and make decisions for themselves, get dirty, solve conflicts. All of those things that we know are very good for our children to have to do in terms of their own development. Maybe we have too much of a focus on achievement. Some of the EDI results certainly point to the fact that kids are reading at a much earlier age, and we get that anecdotally from kindergarten teachers across the province. Not that reading is a bad thing, of course it isn't, but there isn't really any need for us to be expecting our kids to be able to read or play piano or do those things at age 3. Really an opportunity to play and cuddle and talk will really be just as good for their development in the long term. And then finally, this whole increase in diagnosed difficulties. We're now up to 1 in 84 kids in BC diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and that has just been going up exponentially. So there is just a whole host of things that are contributing to childhood vulnerability. They're broad North American cultural trends, but they're also playing out in each of our communities. And I think in each of our communities there's an opportunity for us to get together and talk about these things and think about, are there strategies, are there screen smart strategies that we can put into place in our community? Are there participation type strategies that we can, as a community, support families with young children to reverse some of these trends? Okay, we're going to finish up on a few of the things that we know are making a difference in communities around the province. I call these lessons the necessary but not sufficient lessons. And I do that because I know that if you want to improve vulnerability in your specific community, you have to be doing these things. So they're necessary. But they're not always sufficient, because there are so many other broader regional, provincial, national factors that are impacting on children's development. We have to be working at the same time while we're doing community planning and change on trying to also get that broader policy investment. So the lessons learned, number 1, is that you focus on research. So just as we're doing today, is to really dig down into your EDI results, other research that you have for your community, census information, maybe parent surveys, information that municipalities have, information about the services that you have in your community and who's using them, who's going to the Strong Start centers, who isn't. Really knowing your community so that you can plan for the needs of the children and families is an important component in addressing vulnerability locally. This is about addressing barriers to increase access to services. So I often say that the vulnerability in BC is probably not being driven by people who are going to services. We're pretty good at services, and if families are accessing them, they're probably getting a good quality experience for their children. But for many families, and not just for what we might think of as particularly marginalized families, but for many families who are working long hours or don't have the time to access services, it really is about getting them into services and addressing those barriers. Often what we've done in response to identification of childhood vulnerability is to develop new services. And I'm a very strong advocate for not developing new services until we've been making better use of the ones that we have, because the early child development system is very chaotic for families and not always well linked, can be quite fragmented. And so if you're just adding new services before you're addressing the barriers to increase access, you're actually adding to that chaos rather than contributing to better support for children and families. The next one is to have a strong alignment with the school system. So really knowing that keeping the links between the early childhood system and the K-12 system improves access for families, improves the stability of early childhood services, and also improves the credibility of early childhood services. So really trying to work very closely with your school system in thinking about a seamless array of services right from what they often call these days cradle to career. So how right from the beginning of the child's life and even before in terms of prenatal support, can all of the systems be working together towards launching children into a successful career at age 18. And then the last one is this relationship with municipal and regional policymakers. So knowing that in BC, a lot of the early childhood services are hosted regionally, either by the Ministry of Children and Family Development or by the Health Authority, and in your case it would be the Interior Health Authority. So working closely with those folks, knowing that they can really allocate a lot of funds to reallocate a lot of funds for early childhood services in a way that better supports communities. And I think that's it. I've talked an awful lot, and your ears are probably feeling like cauliflowers or whatever the expression is. What you see up there now is our website, and we've talked a bit about some of the things you can get on that website. The one thing that I didn't mention, which I think is really cool, is that you can get these interactive EDI maps, and the link to that is very clear when you go to the website, so that you can actually zoom in to your communities. You can hold the cursor over your community and really see just in a minute the trends over time on each of the scales. And so there's lots of good resources there. Your community summary, which will give you a bit of interpretation of your results, will be there. Information on the MDI and some of the other research that we do here at HELP as well. And as Jennifer referenced, you can also link to our YouTube channel and various other resources that hopefully will help you in making meaning of the results. So again, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for any questions on anything.
And if you prefer to use, excuse me, if you would prefer to use your microphone, just ask the question orally, just put your hand up and I'll unmute you, so you don't have to type the whole question.
Okay, doesn't sound like there's any more questions. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. It doesn't sound like anything. Doesn't look like there's any more questions at this time. I do believe that we have recorded this webinar, and so if you have any need or interest in having it or sharing any aspects of it with your community, you're more than welcome. As Jennifer said, you can figure out how to get in touch with any of us by going to the website, and we're really open to answering questions that you might have as you go forth. So I suspect that that is,
That's it.
that's goodbye.
Everybody. Thanks for joining us. Let us know if you have any questions. I will post the recording of this on our website. And it will also be posted on our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you, bye.